Hi everyone, it's Eliana and I have a couple of cards to share with you today. I will be using some picket fence supplies along with other things that I have in my stash. I'm first going to start by stamping the Peaches and Piper stamp onto a piece of grid paper. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I am planning to make multiples and I just find it easier to line up my stamped image to my die cut this way. So by stamping it and then using the negative piece, I could line everything up perfect. It's a little more exact because you can line up that halo that's around your stamped image just the way you want it, and then you have everything lined up. Sometimes when you stamp the image, you color it in, and then you try to line it up and run it through the die cutting machine. Your die shifts and it doesn't cut perfectly. So by doing it this way, you have a better chance of getting your image perfectly centered around that die. Now, in order to color it a little bit easier, instead of having to fiddle with these small little pieces, I just added a strip of the 2-inch purple tape onto the negative piece. This is an extra negative piece that I ran because I wanted to leave that other one in the MISTI for later. So I'm just starting off with some warm grays. I have the W00 and I'm going to just add some shadow to the bottom of the bunnies. This is where they're going to be sitting. The reason why I'm adding some warm grays is because if you just leave them white, they kind of just look flat. And by adding a little bit of a shadow in areas where is appropriate, and then you kind of have a little bit more dimension to your image. So I'm just adding those two colors. If you get a little heavy-handed with it, you can just take your blender, your colorless blender, and you can smooth out that shadow. I'm just adding shadows anywhere where I just think that they would be, just around under their arms, around their neck, at the bottom of their ears. So anywhere where I think there might be a little bit of a shadow, I'm just adding the colors. And like I said, if you get a little bit heavy-handed, you can go back and you can just use your colorless blender and blend it all in. Now for the ears, I am using RV00 and RV000, and I am adding a little bit of the rosy cheeks to them too. And then if you get heavy-handed, you can use the colorless blender to smooth it out. Now I am putting my image back into the MISTI. I've left that negative stencil, I'm going to call it negative stencil, in there, and I'm just popping them right in. I am using my VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink so that I can do some clear embossing. I like to do this method, it's called overstamping is what I call it, so that it gives those images a little bit of a pop on my card. I'm just going to be dipping these into my Brutus Monroe clear embossing powder, and I am laying these little pieces onto a piece of cardboard, or it's not cardboard, it's a piece of wood. It's what I use for my watercoloring, and so that way I don't warp my cutting mat when I go to heat emboss. I can't hold these pieces in my hand when I'm embossing with heat embossing because I'll burn my fingers. So if I leave it on this little piece of wood, I could use my craft pick to hold the pieces down. That way I don't burn my fingers. Now for the main part of the card, I am going to be using the 3.5-inch circle from Picket Fence. I've sprayed my stencil with my pixie spray, and now I'm just going to line up my stencil onto my card. I'm just making sure that it is centered, and then I'm going to press everything down because that pixie spray will keep my stencil in place. Now I'm going to be using the Picket Fence grass stencil, and I'm just going to create a scene within that circle. I am pressing it down onto my craft mat so it doesn't move. I just needed it to kind of be straight on my grid so that I could get my grass straight. And now I'm going to be using my Picket Fence life-changing brushes to add some Gina K ink to it, and the color of the Gina K ink is Lucky Clover. So I'm just blending that in, and I like the brushes because it gets nice and tight into that stencil. Now I'm going to take that corresponding inner part of the stencil, and I'm just going to use that to line everything up. So if you just keep the pieces together, you don't have to worry about if your stencil is going to be off. I am masking off the bottom of the stencil. There's a little bit of grass showing, and I don't want to get any blue ink on that. I am using my Picket Fence, I am using my Favorite Things small cloud stencil to create some clouds in the background, and I am using one of my other brushes. As you can see, I have the brush marked with a blue label, and so I just use this bigger brush for any blue. And I'm just using the one brush for both colors. They're both kind of similar, and I just kind of want to add some dimension with the two different shades. And then I'm just going to reposition the stencil to different locations and rotating it, and then you get different cloud formations. And then for the bottom, I'm just going to do both colors and just kind of fill that bottom part of the sky in where it meets the grass. And because I lined up my two stencils together, you're going to get a seamless transition between the grass and the sky. Now that that's all done, I'm just going to pull this off, and there you go, a beautiful scene. And this is where I want to have my bunnies, so I'm going to use that to line up my sentiment. I am using the Picket Fence Small Ways to Say Thank You. They have a ton of little sentiments that you could put underneath that thank you. And so I'm just stamping the thank you directly onto the card, and what I'll do is I'll do the small sentiment on a small strip to put underneath the thank you. So I'm just lining it up. Now this is kind of a cursive one, and it's kind of whimsical, so you don't really have to worry about lining up any of the letters because they kind of just go all over the place. So I just wanted to make sure that it looked straight. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp that directly onto the card, but I'm noticing there's some little specks on the card, and I'm not sure what it is, so I'm just going to take a little bit of my purple tape and lift those up, and luckily it wasn't any ink. So I'm going to prep my card base because the ink blending is probably still a little bit damp, so I want to make sure my embossing powder is not going to stick to the sky, and that way I don't have extra little specks all over the place. I'm just going to add some of the icicle embossing powder from Brutus Monroe. Any strays that still stuck. I'm thinking this is probably the powder from the embossing bag. I just was very generous with it, so it kind of looks like there's embossing powder everywhere, but instead of taking a chance, I'm just going to brush it away with a dry brush. I did use Gina K layering paper for my card panel, so it will be mounted onto a piece of Gina K Turquoise Sea. It's one of my favorite shades of blue. Now to add dimension to the bunnies, I'm going to be using this ThermoWeb Deco Foil Foam. I think that's what it's called. It has, it's a thin piece of foam with adhesive on it. You're supposed to use it with foiling, but it works absolutely perfect for these little die cuts. When you run it through your die cut, the foam does not stretch. And so because it already has the foam because the foam already has adhesive on both sides, it keeps its shape. That backer sheet keeps the foam from mushing out, and then that way you're able to line up your die cut. Similar to when you line up your die cut after you cut like several of them and you layer the die cuts together to create dimension, this foam is absolutely perfect for that. I'll be using that in the future a lot more. I'm removing any smudges with my sand eraser, and I'm going to be cutting out my tiny little sentiment. So I've stamped it onto a scrap piece of pink paper, and I'm just lining up the sentiment with the 1/16 line from my cut-a-line, and I didn't cut all the way through to the other end, so I'm just trimming off that piece so it's easy for me to line things up. Now I am lining things up here, but because there weren't very many letters to line it up, I used the bottom of the sentiment to line it up instead of the top like I normally do, and then it just looked like it was too thick on the top, so I'm lining things up again just to remove a tiny smidge from the top. It was just off by a little bit, and so I'm lining it up again. And you can see with the cut-a-line, you can cut small tiny slivers that you can't with a regular ruler. And so you see that tiny little sliver, it's so tiny that it actually gets stuck inside of the cut-a-line. Here's one little piece, and then there's this other little piece that's just stuck right in there, and so I'm just going to try to pop it out. It's still there, so I'm just going to poke it through with my blade and pull it off the back. So I'm going to line up the edges again with that same 1/16 of a line, and I'm just going to trim the edges. I did cut out the part of the video where my head is in the way, and so that's why it looks a little choppy. You want to make sure that you put pressure over that little piece of paper so that it doesn't slide out from underneath when you cut it with your blade. I've lined everything up, added my sentiment to my card. I've added some Lucy Abram iridescent gems to it, and this card is complete. As you can see, I've made 3, and here's another variation of the same kind of technique, but this time I'm using the sentiment from the Peaches and Piper stamp. Thanks so much for stopping by. I hope you liked this video, and be sure to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe.